While American bombs were falling on Tehran, Beijing was making money. Let that sink in for a second. The United States and Israel just launched the biggest military operation in the Middle East in a generation. Thousands of missiles. The assassination of Iran's supreme leader. The closure of the most critical oil choke point on the planet. The worst energy shock in recorded history. And China? China quietly walked away with everything it wanted. No soldiers deployed. No blood spilled. Not a single fighter jet scrambled. And yet, right now, at this very moment, China is more powerful, more strategically positioned, and more economically dominant than it was before this war started. That's not an accident. And in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how it happened. Move by move. Decision by decision. Because this isn't just a story about Iran. This is a story about who is actually winning the 21st century. And the answer is going to make you deeply uncomfortable. Let's start from the beginning. February 28, 2026. It's a Saturday morning in Tehran. And then the sky splits open. US and Israeli aircraft launched what the Pentagon codenamed Operation Epic Fury. Within the first wave of strikes, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. The man who had led Iran for over 3 decades, gone. In an instant, the entire power structure of the Islamic Republic was decapitated. Iran fired back. Hundreds of missiles. Thousands of drones. They hit US military bases across the region. They hit Israeli cities. They hit Gulf Arab infrastructure. And they did something no country had ever done before in modern history. They closed the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you don't know what that means, let me put it in terms that make your stomach drop. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow strip of water, 21 nautical miles at its tightest point. It looks like nothing on a map. But through that tiny corridor flows 25% of the world's seaborne oil. Every single day. 14 million barrels. Plus 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. Plus a massive chunk of global fertilizer exports. Close that strait and you don't just raise gas prices. You threaten the food supply of entire continents. You ground airline fleets. You paralyze industrial supply chains from Germany to Japan. You push developing nations toward economic collapse. And that's exactly what happened. Oil hit $144 a barrel. Jet fuel tripled. Fertilizer exports from the Persian Gulf, which supply about 30 to 35% of the world's urea, stopped moving. And the ripple effect started hitting places most Americans don't even think about. South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. The whole world was bleeding. But here's the question nobody in Washington was asking loud enough. Who benefits when the world bleeds? We'll get to that. But first, let me take you back a little further, because this story didn't start in February. It started years ago. In a strategy room in Beijing. Here's the thing about China's leadership. They think in decades. Not news cycles. Not election years. Decades. When the first signs of US-Iran tension were escalating in 2025, when Trump came back to power and started tightening the screws on Tehran, Beijing was already preparing. They knew one of two things was going to happen. Either the US-Iran nuclear deal would collapse, or the US would go to war. Either outcome was good for China. Think about that. If diplomacy failed and tensions rose, Iran would become more isolated, more desperate, and more willing to sell China discounted oil under the table, which they'd been doing for years anyway under sanctions. And if war actually broke out? Well, let's just say Beijing had a very detailed contingency plan for that too. This is where things start getting genuinely unsettling. In the months before the February strikes, China quietly renewed its strategic partnership agreements with Iran, deepened port investment projects on the Iranian coast, signed new long-term oil framework deals, And this is the part that gets underreported, quietly built up its own strategic petroleum reserves to a historic high. Now, was that preparation for a war they knew was coming? I can't prove that. Nobody can, definitively. But I can tell you that the timing is remarkable. And in geopolitics, remarkable timing is rarely a coincidence. Because the moment the war started and the Strait of Hormuz closed, China barely flinched. While Europe scrambled, while Japan panicked, while Southeast Asian nations started rationing fuel, China had months of reserves. China had pipeline supply routes through Russia and Central Asia. China had already locked in alternative energy sources that bypassed the Persian Gulf entirely. They were ready. And while everyone else was paying through the nose for whatever oil they could find, China was still buying Iranian crude. At a discount. Through back channels. Because Iran, desperate for revenue, couldn't exactly say no to its only real customer. That was move one. Cheap oil. While the rest of the world paid a war premium, China fueled its economy at a discount. That's not a small thing. That's a massive competitive advantage, the kind that compounds quietly over months and years. But move one was the least sophisticated thing China did. Move two is where it gets really interesting. Let me ask you something. What's the most powerful weapon in the world? Not a nuclear bomb. Not a hypersonic missile. Not an aircraft carrier. It's a spreadsheet. Specifically, China's control over rare earth elements. Rare earths are a group of 17 metallic elements. Their names sound obscure. Neodymium, dysprosium, erbium, praseodymium. But without them, nothing works. Your smartphone needs them. The F-35 fighter jet needs them. Electric vehicles need them. Missile guidance systems need them. Night vision goggles need them. Wind turbines need them. And China controls roughly 60% of the world's rare earth production, and an even higher percentage of rare earth processing. When the Iran war started and US-China tensions spiked, China didn't threaten military action. They didn't make dramatic speeches. They quietly tightened rare earth export controls. Washington felt the chill immediately. Because here's the nightmare scenario nobody talks about in polite policy circles. The United States was fighting a war in the Middle East, deploying precision munitions, advanced electronics, sophisticated guidance systems, all of which depend on components that ultimately trace back to Chinese-controlled materials. You catch the irony, right? America is at war. And its military supply chain runs through the country it considers its primary strategic rival. That's not a headline, that's a horror story. And Beijing knew it, and Beijing was very, very calm about it. Now, pay close attention to what happens next, because this is where the chessboard completely transforms. Most people look at the Iran war and see two players, the United States and Iran, maybe Israel on the sidelines. But there was a third player making moves the whole time, and that player wasn't even at the table. In late March and early April of 2026, Pakistan, of all countries, emerged as the surprise mediator between Washington and Tehran. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Army Chief Asim Munir personally brokered a ceasefire that shocked the entire diplomatic world. Pakistan, the country that most Americans couldn't find on a map without help. The country that had been fighting its own military skirmish with India just a year earlier. The country that had been written off as a failing state by half the think tanks in Washington. That country just did what no European nation, no Gulf Arab state, no UN diplomat could do. It got the United States and Iran into the same room in Islamabad for the first time in nearly 5 decades. And guess where Pakistan's foreign minister flew immediately after those talks? Beijing. He sat down with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and together they issued a 5-point peace framework. Ceasefire, humanitarian access, restore freedom of navigation, expand the UN role, begin comprehensive negotiations. China didn't fire a shot. China didn't spend a dollar on the war. And China just positioned itself as the indispensable architect of Middle East peace. Let that image sit in your brain for a moment. The United States starts a war, spends hundreds of billions of dollars, loses international credibility across the global south, creates the worst energy crisis in modern history. And China, without doing anything that looks like warfare, emerges as the statesman, the responsible global power, the adult in the room. That is not luck. That is a long-term strategy executing exactly as designed. If you want to understand the real power games shaping the world, the moves behind the moves, make sure you're subscribed, because this is the kind of analysis you won't find in a 3-minute cable news hit. Now, let's talk about the summit. May 14th, 2026. Air Force One lands in Beijing. For the first time since 2017, when Trump made his first presidential visit to China, an American president was back on Chinese soil for a state visit. And the optics alone told the whole story. Trump needed this meeting more than she did. Think about why. The Iran war was dragging on. It was deeply unpopular at home. The Strait of Hormuz was still a mess. Oil prices were wrecking American household budgets. And Trump needed China to pressure Iran to reopen the strait. She knew all of that. And so when the two leaders sat down in the Great Hall of the People, with all the ceremony and grandeur that Beijing had choreographed to perfection, the power dynamic in that room was nothing like what the official photograph suggested. Xi Jinping opened with a warning about Taiwan. Not subtle. Not wrapped in diplomatic language. A direct warning. Mishandling Taiwan, he said, would put the entire US-China relationship into what he called, and this is the official translated quote, great jeopardy. The room went quiet. And Trump's response? He said he wanted things to stay the way they are. In diplomatic language, that phrase, stay the way they are, is a massive concession. It means no escalating arms sales, no stronger security guarantees, no provocative congressional visits to Taipei. It means the status quo, which China is slowly, deliberately eroding in its favor, gets to continue. Taiwan was watching, and Taiwan understood exactly what it heard. But here's where the summit gets even more revealing. Trump needed something from China. He wanted Beijing to press Iran to reopen the strait, to use its economic leverage with Tehran to restore the energy flows that were bleeding the global economy. And Xi's response was essentially, "We are trying." That's it. We're trying. Not a commitment. Not a timeline. Not a deliverable. We're trying. Because here's the strategic reality Xi understood and Trump apparently did not. A closed Strait of Hormuz was not China's problem. China had already rerouted its energy supply. China was buying discounted Iranian oil through back channels. The sky-high global oil prices were weakening China's economic competitors in Europe and Japan, not China. Why would China rush to fix a situation that was working in its favor? Think about that question very carefully. The United States flew its president to Beijing, hat in hand, asking China to help clean up a mess America made. And China said, "Sure, we'll try," while doing absolutely nothing to change the underlying situation. That's not diplomacy. That's dominance wearing a suit. Now let's talk about something that gets almost zero coverage in American media. And it might be the most consequential part of this entire story. The Global South. There are roughly 130 to 150 countries that define themselves as part of the developing world. Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, parts of the Middle East. Billions of people. These countries have been watching this war very carefully, and what they've seen has permanently shifted how they think about American power. Here's what the Hormuz closure did to developing nations. Energy costs exploded. Fertilizer supplies collapsed. Remember, the Persian Gulf supplies about a third of the world's fertilizer exports. That means food production cycles were disrupted. That means inflation in countries that were already struggling. That means political instability in places that couldn't absorb another economic shock. And the United States, the country that started this war, offered them what exactly? Very little. While Washington was focused on the military campaign, while the White House was managing domestic political fallout, while the State Department was trying to navigate ceasefire negotiations, the needs of 100 developing nations were not a priority. China noticed that gap, and China moved into it. China offered favorable energy financing to energy import-dependent nations. China accelerated Belt and Road projects, its massive infrastructure network of roads, ports, rail lines, and digital systems connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe, with China at the center of every node. China signed new bilateral trade agreements in yuan, not dollars. That last detail is critical. We'll come back to it. China positioned itself as the reliable partner. The one that showed up. The one that didn't start a war and then ignore the collateral damage. The one that came with investment instead of bombs. In the global south, narratives matter enormously. Stories of who helped and who didn't travel fast. And the story being told right now, across dozens of developing nations, is that when things got bad, China was there and America was distracted. That story will shape alliances for a generation. And this brings us to what might be the most dangerous move of all. The dollar. Stay with me here, because this is where geopolitics meets your bank account. Since the early 1970s, the world's oil has been bought and sold primarily in US dollars. This arrangement, known as the Petrodollar system, is one of the foundational pillars of American global power. Because if you need dollars to buy oil, you need to hold dollars. And if every major economy is holding dollars, that keeps American interest rates low, American borrowing costs manageable, and American economic influence enormous. The petrodollar is why the United States can run massive deficits without the kind of currency collapse that would destroy any other country. And China has been trying to dismantle it for years. Here's how the Iran war accelerated that process. When the Hormuz closure sent energy markets into chaos, many countries in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa started asking a very uncomfortable question. If the global energy system is this fragile, if one US military decision can close the world's most critical oil passage and send shockwaves through every economy, do we really want to keep all our eggs in the dollar basket? China was ready with an answer. Buy your energy in yuan. Trade with us in yuan. Settle your debts in yuan. And you won't be at the mercy of decisions made in Washington. Several Gulf states that had been quietly exploring yuan-denominated oil contracts before the war accelerated those discussions dramatically. Nations in Southeast Asia deepened yuan swap agreements with Beijing. And the UAE, which actually quit OPEC effective May 1, 2026, began expanding its direct financial ties with China. None of this happened overnight. None of it is complete. The dollar is still the world's dominant reserve currency and will remain so for years. But the direction of travel has changed. And the Iran war didn't just nudge that needle. It shoved it. Every percentage point that the petrodollar system weakens is a percentage point of American global leverage that evaporates. And right now, China is systematically, patiently, relentlessly working to push that percentage point every single month. Now I want to bring this back to something personal, to something that affects you directly. Whether you're watching this from an apartment in New York or a suburb in Texas or a campus in California. What does it mean for you if China wins this quiet war? Here's what analysts who study this for a living will tell you if you get them off the record. It means higher borrowing costs. Eventually, as the dollar loses its privileged global status, the US government can no longer borrow as cheaply as it does today. That hits everything. Federal spending, social programs, military budgets, infrastructure, your mortgage rate. It means supply chain dependency that cannot be fixed quickly. The United States is deeply reliant on Chinese manufacturing, Chinese rare earth processing, Chinese pharmaceutical ingredient supply. Decades of offshoring decisions made to maximize short-term corporate profit have left America's industrial base hollowed out in ways that don't show up clearly until a crisis hits. And it means a world where the institutions that the US built after World War II, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN Security Council architecture, are increasingly challenged by a parallel system that China is constructing, block by block, deal by deal, port by port. That's not a crazy prediction. That's already happening. Now let's talk about the move that almost nobody saw coming: Taiwan. Throughout the Beijing summit, Taiwan hovered over every conversation like a storm system nobody wanted to acknowledge, and Xi Jinping made sure it was impossible to ignore. His warning to Trump, "Mishandle Taiwan and the relationship falls apart," was not a throwaway line. It was a carefully calculated message. And the message was this: you are already overextended. You are fighting a war in the Middle East. Your public is tired and your treasury is strained. You cannot afford a second front. And Trump's "stay the way they are" response was China's answer. For years, Taiwan has relied on strategic ambiguity, the idea that the United States might or might not defend Taiwan if China attacked, and that ambiguity itself was a deterrent. The uncertainty kept Beijing cautious. But when the American president, in a direct meeting with Xi, signals that he wants the status quo maintained, and the status quo is one that China is steadily eroding in its favor, that ambiguity starts to collapse. Not dramatically, not with a declaration, but quietly, incrementally, the deterrent effect weakens. Beijing knows this. Beijing is patient. And Taiwan watched the summit, and Taiwan understood exactly what the subtext was. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because here's what China got from this entire episode: without firing a single bullet at America, without deploying a single warship toward Taiwan, without doing anything that looks like aggression in any conventional sense, China got cheap oil while its competitors paid war prices. China tightened its grip on rare earth supply chains at exactly the moment America needed them most. China positioned itself as the indispensable peace architect in the world's most volatile region. China expanded its influence across the global south at record speed. China accelerated the slow-motion shift away from dollar dominance. China extracted a de facto Taiwan concession from the American president in Beijing. And it did all of this while the American media was focused on missile footage and ceasefire negotiations and Trump's Truth Social posts. That's the story nobody's telling.